When one of the richest men in the world decided to do something for his mother, he did not post about it. He did not call a press conference. He did not tell a single reporter. He just quietly bought her a house, a beautiful house on a tree-lined street with a wide porch and a big kitchen, and lavender growing along the front walk. A house that said, "You are safe now. You can stop starting over." And for a little while, nobody knew. But here is the thing about Mae Musk. She had spent her whole life starting over. She had raised 3 children alone with barely enough money to feed them. There were nights she ate 1 small plate so her kids could eat more. There were mornings she smiled at the door and cried in the dark so they would never have to carry her fear. She had worked every job that would pay her, and some that barely did. She had counted coins in grocery stores. She had moved cities. She had moved countries. She had started from nothing so many times that starting from nothing had stopped feeling like a disaster and started feeling like just another Tuesday. She had survived all of it, and her son had never forgotten a single day of it. So when Elon Musk, the man who builds rockets, the man who was told the impossible and did it anyway, quietly signed the papers on that house, he was not just buying his mother a home. He was trying to fix something that had been broken for 30 years. A door he had stood outside as a small boy with bare feet on a cold floor, listening to the one sound in the world he could not make stop. And when Mae walked through that front door for the very first time, she stood in the kitchen, and she looked at the morning light coming through the windows, and she pressed one hand flat against the wall. Just one hand. Flat. Still, like she needed to feel through her palm that something real was finally hers. That is where most people thought the story ended. Rich son, grateful mother, beautiful house. Everyone feels warm. The internet moves on. But Mae did not sit down. She picked up the phone and made 3 calls. And what happened next? What she did with that house, what she built from it, what grew out of her kitchen and onto that porch and spread down that street and then across the world, is something that nobody saw coming. Not Elon, not the neighbors, not the internet. And there is one more person in this story. A woman who had been watching from across the street every single Saturday for months. Standing at the edge of her driveway, never crossing, never coming in. Carrying a secret that goes all the way back to a cold winter night 40 years ago. A secret that connects to Mae in a way that will stop you completely when you find out what it is. Stay with us for the whole video, because what happens next will not just make you cry, it will make you want to get up and do something, and that is the whole point of this story. Her name was Mae, and she was born with fire in her chest. Not the loud, angry kind of fire. Not the kind that roars and spits and burns everything it touches. The quiet kind. The kind that does not need anyone to see it to keep burning. The kind that stays lit even when the rain comes down hard and the cold gets into the walls and the night feels like it will never end. That fire kept her alive more times than she could count. Mae grew up moving. Her family did not believe in staying still. Her parents were the kind of people who looked at a map and saw possibility instead of distance. They flew small planes over deserts. They drove across land that had no roads. They packed up and moved and unpacked and moved again from South Africa to Canada and back and forward, as if the whole world were a house with many rooms and they meant to sleep in everyone. Mae grew up believing she could do anything. And then life showed her what anything actually cost. She married young. She was in love. Truly, she believed that then. But the marriage grew dark in ways she had not expected, and after years of trying to hold something together that could not be held, she found herself standing alone. 3 children beside her. Not enough money, not enough help. Not enough of anything except need. Her children were small. The oldest was a boy named Elon. He was a quiet child mostly. He sat with books the way other children sat with toys, holding them like they were the most important objects in the world, turning pages fast, always hungry for the next thing. By the time he was 9 years old, he had read every single book in his school library. Everyone. When there were no more books, he started reading encyclopedias. Front to back. His mother noticed, but she did not have time to think too long about it. She was working. She was always working. She was a dietitian by training, a model by necessity. She took every job that would pay her and some that barely did. She woke before the children and went to sleep after them. She moved cities when the work dried up. She moved countries when the cities ran out. She started over so many times that starting over stopped feeling like defeat and started feeling like just another Tuesday. But some Tuesdays were harder than others. There was a stretch, a long gray stretch, that she has spoken about in her own words, in her own book, in interviews where she looks back without bitterness, but without softening the truth either. When she had almost nothing. She counted coins in her palm at the grocery store, doing the math quietly so no one would see. She ate one small plate at dinner and told her children she was not hungry. She smiled every morning when she sent them to school, and she cried every night when the house went quiet and they could not hear her. She did not want them to carry the weight, so she carried it alone. There was a street in Toronto where they lived during one of the hardest winters. A narrow street with old houses pressed close together, and snow that came in sideways off the lake and did not stop for weeks. The coats Moy's children wore were not quite thick enough for that kind of cold. She knew it. She had no solution yet. She was working on one. A woman lived across the street. Her name was Dorothea Crane. Dorothea was 60 years old at the time, recently retired from 40 years of teaching. She had silver hair cut close to her head, a straight back, and hands that were always warm, the kind of warm that comes from decades of pressing them around mugs of tea and patting the shoulders of frightened children and doing the slow work of caring for people without expecting much in return. Dorothea noticed things. She noticed the lights in May's house that stayed on past midnight. She noticed the children's thin coats. She noticed the way May stood at the end of the driveway each morning and waved brightly, too brightly, as if she were performing okay for an audience. Dorothea had been a teacher for a long time. She knew the difference between someone who was fine and someone who had simply learned to look fine. One evening in January, she made a pot of soup. A big pot. She carried it across the street through the snow and knocked on the door. When May opened it, Dorothea said, "I made too much. Would your family like some?" She did not say, "I can see you are struggling." She did not say, "I feel sorry for you." She did not make it into something May would have to carry alongside everything else she was already carrying. She just offered soup. May looked at the pot. She looked at Dorothea's warm hands holding it. She looked at this woman standing in the cold, asking nothing, giving everything. And then, for just 1 second, the smile she wore every day like a second coat, the one she put on in the morning and took off only in the dark, cracked open. Not into sadness, into something more honest than sadness, into relief. "Thank you," she said, And she meant it in every possible direction. She meant it for the soup and for the kindness and for the fact that someone had looked across the street and seen her, really seen her, and had not looked away. She let Dorothea in. She fed her children. And something small and bright and important began on that cold Toronto night. Something that neither woman understood yet. Something that would take 40 years and a house on a different street and a son who grew up to be the richest person in the world before it came full circle. But we will get there. First, the fire had to keep burning. And it did. It always did. Let us talk about Elon for a moment. Not the Elon that newspapers write about. Not the rockets shooting into the dark sky. Not the electric cars or the satellites or the loud arguments on the internet that everybody seems to have an opinion about. Not the man on the magazine covers with his arms crossed and his jaw set like someone who has already decided he is going to win. The other Elon, the small one. The boy who stood in a dark hallway late at night in a house in South Africa with his bare feet on the cold floor, listening at his mother's door. He could hear her crying. It was not loud crying, it was the quiet kind. The kind a person does when they are trying very hard not to be heard. The kind that comes out in small, careful pieces, like someone trying to let just a little bit of pressure out of a bottle before the whole thing breaks. He stood there for a long moment, then he raised his hand and knocked. Once. Softly. The crying stopped immediately. A pause. The sound of something being set down. A breath being taken and held and shaped into something steady. The door opened. His mother stood there. Her eyes were clear, her face was calm, she was smiling. "Go to sleep," she said. "Everything is fine." He went back to bed. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He was 10 years old. He did not fully understand money yet, or why there was never enough of it, or why his mother's hands shook sometimes when she opened envelopes from the post. But he understood one thing very clearly, with the particular sharpness that children have before the world softens their edges. Something was wrong, and he could not fix it. That feeling, the helplessness of standing outside a closed door with nothing to offer, went down into him like a splinter, deep and small and almost invisible, but always there, always working its way further in. He grew up. He left South Africa. He went to Canada, then to America. He started companies. Some failed fast and some failed slowly, and some, against every reasonable expectation, succeeded beyond anything that could have been planned. He built Tesla. He built SpaceX. He sent a car into orbit around the sun just to see if he could. He was on the cover of magazines. He was in arguments on the internet. He was, by the time he was in his 40s, one of the wealthiest human beings who had ever existed on this planet. And his mother was renting an apartment. This bothered him more than almost anything. He did not talk about it. That was not how he was built. He was not a man who sat with feelings and described them out loud. He was a man who identified a problem and found the fastest route to solving it. Feelings to him were like engineering challenges. You did not sit around discussing how hard the problem was. You got to work. But this problem he had not solved. Not yet. Every time a reporter asked him about his mother in an interview, and they asked often because the story of Elon Musk was the kind of story that people could not help reaching for, he answered the same way. Carefully, quietly. His voice changed just slightly, dropping a half tone lower, the way a person's voice does when they are touching something they usually keep behind glass. "She sacrificed a great deal," he would say. Always that word, Sacrifice. As if the boy outside the door were still inside him somewhere, still counting the cost of all those years she carried things alone so her children would not have to. The person who finally made him act was not a family member. It was not a therapist or a business advisor or a friend who sat him down for a serious conversation. It was a woman named Celine Park. Celine was a coordinator on Elon's personal team. Not a flashy title, not a big office. She was the kind of person who kept everything moving without needing anyone to notice. Organized, observant, and quietly excellent at her job. She had worked with enough powerful people to know that the bigger a person's life became, the easier it was for the small, important things to get buried under the enormous, urgent ones. She was reorganizing Elon's old digital notes one afternoon when she found it. 3 words, written in plain text. No date attached, no follow-up task, no reminder set. Just 3 words sitting alone at the bottom of a note file, like something that had been set down in a hurry and then forgotten on a shelf. House for Mom. She printed it out on a single sheet of paper. That evening, after a long meeting had ended and the room had emptied, she walked to where Elon was still sitting and placed the paper on the table in front of him. She said nothing. He looked at the paper. He looked at it for a long time. "How long ago did I write this?" he asked. 3 years, Celine said. The room was very quiet. 3 years. He had written it and buried it under 1,000 other things. And somewhere in those 3 years, his mother had kept waking up early and cooking in a rented kitchen, and sitting on a rented porch in the morning light as if she were not waiting for anything. As if she needed nothing, as if everything were fine. He pushed back from the table. "Find me something," he said. Celine had her notebook ready. What kind of something? He did not say high-end property. He did not say investment value. He did not think about square footage or resale or market trends. He thought about a cold Toronto street and a woman who came across it carrying a pot. He thought about his mother's face in the morning versus his mother's face alone at night. He thought about what safe actually looked like. "A big porch," he said. "She sits outside in the mornings." Celine wrote it down. "A proper kitchen. She cooks. She has always cooked." Another note. "And neighbors who are close enough." He paused. He looked at the table, not at Selena. She should have people nearby. She should not be too alone. He stopped. He turned back to his screen. Selene saw just for a second his jaw tighten. The way a person tightens when something is pressing against the inside of them, and they are choosing, as they always choose, to hold it in. She left quietly. She went to work. The search took months. It was run carefully under a company name that meant nothing to anyone. No press, no leaks. Small team, strict instructions. When they found the house, Selene called Elon at 7 in the morning. She described it simply. Tree-lined street, wide porch facing the morning sun, kitchen with large windows, a garden in the back that had been left a little wild. Not a mansion. Not something that said, "Look at what my son can afford." Something that said, "You are home now. You are safe. You can stop starting over." He said, "Buy it." She bought it. The paperwork was signed on a Tuesday. Quietly. The way the best things are often done. That evening, Elon called his mother. They talked for 20 minutes. He asked how she was. She said she was fine. He asked about her work. She told him. They laughed twice. He said he loved her, and she said the same, and they hung up. He sat in the silence after the call for a little while. He thought about a door and a hallway and the cold floor under his bare feet. Then he went back to work. He did not know yet what his mother was going to do with what he had given her, but she already knew. She had known since before she even saw it. She had known since that winter in Toronto when a woman with warm hands stood in the cold and offered something she did not have to offer. May had been waiting 40 years to pass it on. Now she had a place to do it. May found out about the house the way most people find out about the most important moments in their lives. Not dramatically, just suddenly. She was sitting at a small table in a restaurant in the middle of a perfectly ordinary Thursday lunch when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The name that came up was not Elon's. It was a woman she did not know. Someone named Celine Park, with a number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer, but something in her, that old instinct that had been sharpened by years of surviving, of reading rooms and weather and the expressions on people's faces before they even spoke, told her to pick up. She excused herself from the table. She walked to the quiet corner near the window and answered. Celine introduced herself carefully. She said she worked with Elon's team. She said Elon had asked her to make this call. She said there was something that could not be explained over the phone. Something that needed to be seen in person, at a particular address, whenever May was available. There was a pause. May had survived enough in her life to know what it felt like when something large was moving toward her. She had felt it before. The particular stillness in the air just before everything changed, the way you feel it before a storm, even before you can see the clouds. She said simply, "Tell me where." She drove there that same afternoon. The neighborhood was not one she knew well. The street was lined with old trees whose branches reached across and nearly touched each other above the road, making a kind of tunnel of green and gold in the early spring light. She drove slowly. The light through the trees fell in pieces on the windshield, and she watched it the way you watch something that is almost too pretty to be real. She found the house. She parked. She sat in the car. She did not get out right away. She looked at the house through the windshield for a long, quiet moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The house was not enormous. It was not the kind of thing that made you feel small standing in front of it. It was the other kind, the kind that made you feel welcomed before you even reached the door. The porch was wide, wrapping around the front and side like open arms. The windows were large and clean. Someone had planted lavender along the path to the front steps, small and purple and swaying very slightly in the April breeze. It looked kind. That was the word that came to her. Not grand, not impressive. Kind. Celine was waiting on the porch steps. She stood when she saw Mai get out of the car. She walked down the path and held out a single key. Brass, small, ordinary. "He wanted you to open it yourself," Selena said quietly. Maya looked at the key sitting in Selena's palm. She looked at it the way you look at something that is small on the outside but enormous on the inside. A key that opened a door. A door that opened a life. A life that looked completely different from the one that had included counting coins in a grocery store and eating one small plate so the children could have more. She took the key. She walked up the porch steps. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The door opened. Inside, the house was full of light. That was the first thing she felt. Not saw, but felt. The light was everywhere. It came through the kitchen windows in long, pale columns and lay across the wooden floor in warm rectangles. It came through the side windows onto the walls. The house breathed light the way some houses breathe cold and shadow. She walked slowly, room by room. She touched nothing at first, just looked. The kitchen, exactly as Elon had asked for. Wide windows, counter space that meant something, room enough to cook for more than one. The back garden visible through the glass, green and slightly wild and full of the particular promise of something not yet decided. The porch that wrapped around the corner so that the morning sun would come from two directions. She stopped in the kitchen. She stood still. The light came through the windows and fell on the floor and on her hands, and she stood in it and did not move for a very long time. Then she pressed her right hand flat against the wall. Just one hand. Flat. Still. Steady. The way you press your hand against something when you need your whole body to confirm what your eyes are telling you. When the realness of a thing is so large that seeing is not enough, and you need to feel it through your palm, through your skin, through every nerve that connects your hand to your heart. It was real. The wall was solid. The house was real. The light was real. The lavender outside and the wide porch and the kitchen built for cooking. All of it real. She stayed like that for a moment that was longer than a moment. Then she took her hand down. She called Elon that evening. They were not a family of long speeches. They were not a family who sat with big feelings and turned them over out loud until every angle was examined. They were a family who showed love through doing, who said important things in short sentences, and trusted the other person to hear everything underneath. She said, "It's beautiful." He said, "Good." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You deserved it a long time ago." And then there was a silence. Not an empty one. The fullest kind of silence. The kind that is packed so tight with everything that was never said that it has no room for another single word. 30 years of thin coats and counted coins. 30 years of smiling at the door and crying in the dark. A small boy on a cold floor outside a closed door. A woman who carried the fear so her children would not have to. All of it in the silence between two sentences on a phone call. Then May said, "I'm going to do something with it." Elon said, "I know." He laughed then, a soft, quiet laugh, the kind that has nothing to do with humor and everything to do with recognition. The laugh you laugh when something turns out to be exactly what it was always supposed to be. She heard it and smiled. She hung up. She stood in her new kitchen in the falling evening light and looked around at the walls and the windows and the garden going dark outside the glass. Now. Here is where most people, when they heard the story later, assumed everything had ended. Rich son buys mother a house. Mother is grateful. World feels briefly warm. The internet moves on to the next thing. But that was not the end. That was not close to the end. Because May Musk, the woman who had once eaten one orange for dinner and called it enough, who had smiled through every hard morning and wept through every quiet night, who had pressed her palm against a wall to confirm that something real was finally hers. She did not sit down. She picked up her phone. She made 3 calls. The first was to a woman named Rosalind Okafor. The second was to a man named Thomas Whitfield. The third was to a small community organization called the Sparrow Table that almost nobody outside of a few neighborhoods had heard of yet. She moved into the house on a Saturday in May. She came with boxes that were not many, with her good pots wrapped in cloth with a small photograph of her 3 children, taken long ago. Elon squinting into the sun and laughing at something the camera could not see. She hung that photograph in the kitchen beside the morning light window. Then she started cooking. For 2 weeks, the neighborhood noticed nothing unusual. A light on early, a light off late. Soft music sometimes through the open window on warm evenings. Then, on the first Saturday of June, something appeared on the wide front porch. A table. Long and wooden, set with chairs that did not match each other. A jar of wildflowers in the center. Steam rising from pots that were much too large for one person's breakfast. And people. People who had nowhere else to be on a Saturday morning. People who were hungry in ways that were about more than food. People who were counting coins and starting over and carrying the fear alone so that others would not have to. The neighbors peered from behind curtains at first, unsure. Then one opened their door, then another. Then a small child appeared in yellow rain boots that no one had invited, but who walked straight up the porch steps, as if they had been expected all along, the way children do when they can feel that something good is happening, and they do not yet know enough to hold back. By noon on that first Saturday, 12 people were eating at the table. The following Saturday it was 20. By August, the wild garden in the back had been transformed into something that would make you stop walking and simply stand and look. But we are moving too fast. Before the garden, before all of it, there's someone you need to meet. Her name was Rosalind, and she had a notebook. Rosalind Okafor had a notebook. It was not a beautiful notebook. It was not leather-bound or gold-edged or the kind of thing you buy from a shop that wraps it in tissue paper. It was a plain green spiral notebook, the kind that sits in a bin at the front of a drugstore for $2, the kind that students buy in September and lose by November. The cover was soft with use. The corners were bent. The spiral had been pushed back into shape more than once. But she had carried it for 11 years without putting it down. And in it, written in her careful, upright handwriting, was a list that most people would never know existed. The names of every single person she had ever helped feed. 417 names when May called her in May. 417 people who had sat somewhere because Rosalind had made sure there was somewhere to sit. 417 people who had eaten, because Rosalind had made sure there was something to eat. She kept the names, she said, because hunger was not a statistic. It is a person, she told anyone who asked, and every person deserves to be remembered. Rosalind was 53 years old. She had been born in Lagos and had come to North America as a young woman with 2 suitcases, and the kind of determination that does not require an audience to stay strong. She studied social work. She worked in food banks, then community kitchens, then anywhere that needed someone who understood the difference between a person who is barely holding on and a person who has let go is sometimes nothing more than one meal and one person who showed up. She was not famous. She drove a car with a dent in the rear door that she had never gotten fixed because the money always seemed better used elsewhere. She owned 3 work jackets, one for cold weather, one for mild weather, one for rain, and rotated them through the week without variation. She did not have a large following on the internet. She did not give speeches at big conferences or appear on television. She just showed up. Every week somewhere, she just showed up with the green notebook and the names, and the belief that the work mattered even when nobody was watching. She and May had met 3 years earlier at a small conference on community nutrition. All the seats at the lunch tables had been taken, and they had ended up next to each other by simple arithmetic. 2 women, 1 empty table, a shared plate of food that someone had left unclaimed. They had talked for 2 hours. They had laughed twice and argued gently once about the best way to stretch a food budget without sacrificing dignity, which was the kind of argument that only people who deeply cared about the same thing could have. They had exchanged numbers at the end and stayed in touch the way busy people do. A message here, a phone call there, a useful article sent on a quiet Tuesday morning with no subject line because none was needed. When May called her that morning in May, Rosalind was standing in a parking lot outside a food bank, finishing the last cold inch of a coffee she had bought 3 hours earlier. May said, "I have a house, I have a big kitchen, I have a porch, and I have a feeling." Rosalind dropped the coffee cup in the nearest bin. "What kind of feeling?" she asked. "The kind," May said, "that has been waiting a very long time." Rosalind drove to the house the following afternoon. She walked through it the way she walked through every space she entered for the first time. Not as a guest, but as someone who was already asking questions. Her eyes moved over the kitchen counter, measuring length. She looked at the stove. She looked at the size of the porch. She walked to the back window and looked at the garden. Wild and overgrown and full of the particular energy of a thing that had been left alone long enough to become something on its own terms. She stood in the kitchen in the morning light. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many do you want to feed?" May said, "As many as need feedin'." Rosalind opened the green notebook. She started writing. What they built in the weeks that followed was not an organization. Not yet. It had no name on paper, no bank account, no logo, no application forms. It was simpler than all of that. It was a woman who had a house and a kitchen and a porch, and a woman who had a notebook and a list of 417 names, and between them they had enough. They called it the Saturday table. The rules were short enough to fit on the back of a hand. You came if you were hungry. You came if you were lonely. You came if you needed to sit somewhere that was not going to ask you to earn your seat, or explain your circumstances, or perform gratitude for the people watching. You came, you sat, you ate, you were welcome. That was it. That was all of it. Thomas Whitfield arrived on a Saturday in July. He was 61 years old and he had recently lost 3 things in fast succession: his job to retirement, his wife to illness, and the shape of his days to the sudden, terrifying blankness that follows when everything that structured your life disappears at once. He had been a carpenter for 40 years. His hands were large and calloused and had spent 4 decades building things. Decks, frames, furniture, the kind of solid and useful objects that outlast the people who make them. Now his hands had nothing to do. His kitchen table had 1 chair pulled out and the rest pushed in, and the space around that single chair felt enormous in the mornings. He had been driving without particular purpose on a Saturday when he passed the house and saw the long table on the porch and the steam from the pots and the people sitting together in the early light. He parked his car across the street. He sat in it for 10 full minutes watching. He was not a man who asked for things. He had been raised by people who believed that needing help was a private failing, something to be solved quietly and alone. That belief had served him for 60 years and had also, in these recent hollow months, kept him sitting in an empty kitchen with his hands folded on a table with 1 chair pulled out. Finally, he got out of the car. He walked up the porch steps. He said quietly to nobody in particular, looking at the ground, "I'm not sure I should be here." May turned from the stove. She looked at this large, quiet man with his work-worn hands and his downward eyes and his voice that was trying very hard to take up as little space as possible. She said, "Of course you should. Sit down." He sat down. He ate. He did not say much, but he came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. And slowly, the way people open when they have been given enough warmth and enough time and enough of being asked nothing in return, he began to come back to himself. By the third Saturday, he was not just sitting. He had fixed the loose board on the porch steps. He had not been asked. He had simply seen it needed doing and done it. The way a carpenter sees every broken thing in every room as a quiet request. He repaired the latch on the garden gate the week after that. Then he stood at the edge of the wild back garden one morning with his hands on his hips and his eyes moving over the untamed beds with the particular look of a man who has found something to build. "I could put in raised beds," he said to May. "Yes," she said. She did not hesitate for even half a second. "I would need lumber. And the good soil, not the cheap kind." "Tell me what you need," she said. He told her. She got it. No ceremony, no discussion, no making him feel the weight of the asking. By September, 6 raised beds stood in the back garden, straight and solid, planted with tomatoes and kale and 3 kinds of herbs and the hardy winter vegetables that keep producing long after the first frost has come and gone. Thomas brought someone with him in August. His name was Callum. His late wife's nephew, 24 years old, recently unemployed, currently sleeping on a cousin's couch and carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has not had a good night's sleep in several months, because worry does not observe bedtime. Callum sat at the table on that first Saturday and ate without talking much. The following Saturday, he came back on his own. The Saturday after that, he helped Thomas plant the last of the raised beds. He asked questions about the soil. He listened. He came back again. 2 months later, he had a job. Not a grand job. A start. But a start that had come in some way that was hard to trace exactly, but impossible not to feel, from the Saturday mornings and the soil under his fingernails and the simple, reliable fact that there was a place he was expected. He shook Thomas's hand on the porch in the morning he told him. Thomas gripped the hand back firmly. Then he turned and looked out at the garden, at the straight rows and the full beds and the tomatoes going red in the late summer sun. And he kept looking for a long moment, his jaw set, his eyes very bright. Rosalind wrote Callum's name in the green notebook. The table kept growing, week by week, name by name, bowl by bowl. And still, outside the neighborhood, nobody knew. No posts, no tagged locations, no photographs shared online. May had asked gently, but with the kind of certainty that people do not argue with, that the table remain quiet. Not hidden. Just quiet. "There is a difference," she said to Rosalind one morning, stirring a pot with a long wooden spoon, steam rising around her face, "between sharing something and performing it." She kept stirring. "When you perform kindness," she said, "it stops being kindness. It becomes a show, and a show is for the people watching. This table is not for the people watching." She looked at Rosalind. "This table is for the people eating." Rosalind nodded. She did not write it in the green notebook. She wrote it somewhere deeper than that. Somewhere that did not need pages. It was a photograph that started everything. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind of photograph that is planned and staged and taken by someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why. It was small, quiet. The kind of photograph that almost does not get taken at all. The kind where someone raises their phone almost without thinking, because something in front of them is too gentle and too true to let pass without record. The woman who took it was named Priya Sadhwani. She lived 2 houses down the street and had been coming to the Saturday table since August. She was a writer, not a journalist, not someone with a column or a contract or a deadline. Just a person who had always needed to write things down in order to understand them, the way some people need to run to clear their heads or paint to feel their feelings. She kept a small personal blog that her mother read faithfully and almost nobody else did. On a Saturday morning in October, she stepped onto her front porch with her coffee and looked down the street. The table was full. The steam from the pots rose in the cold morning air. The wildflowers in the jar were the last of the season, a little ragged at the edges but still bright. The shapes of people sitting and talking and eating were soft and blurred at the edges, the way people look when their breath is visible in the cold, and everything has that particular stillness of early October. She raised her phone. She took one photograph. From a distance, no faces, just the table and the steam and the shapes and the flowers and the light coming through the trees onto all of it. She posted it on her blog that afternoon with a caption that took her 20 minutes to write and ended up being only 2 sentences long. Something beautiful is happening on my street every Saturday. I don't have words for it yet, but I'm grateful. She did not mention May. She did not mention the house or the address or any names at all. She set her phone down and made dinner and did not think much more about it. For 1 full week, nothing happened. Then someone shared the post. Then someone else shared it from there. Then someone else again. And again. The way things move on the internet when they carry something real inside them. Not with noise and argument, but with the quiet urgency of people pressing something into another person's hands and saying simply, "Look at this. Just look at this." A journalist named Dara Osei saw the photograph on a Tuesday morning while she was eating breakfast. Dara worked for a mid-sized online magazine that covered human interest stories. The kind of publication that was not famous but was respected by the people who mattered, because Dara and the small team around her had a gift for finding the things that were happening quietly, just below the surface of the loud world, that were somehow more important than everything making noise above it. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she started asking questions. She was careful about it. She did not call anyone demanding answers. She did not publish a single word yet. She found the street. She spoke gently to a few people in the neighborhood. She gathered threads without pulling any of them too hard. And then on a Saturday morning, she drove to the street and parked and walked to the corner at the end of the block and stood there. She watched. She saw the table set with its mismatched chairs. She saw the jar of last wildflowers. She saw people arriving on foot, some alone, some in pairs, some with children who ran straight toward the garden without ceremony. She saw May, not at the center of things, not standing somewhere important, just moving, filling a bowl here, pulling up a chair for someone there, pausing to say something to Thomas that made him laugh, a real laugh, the kind that starts in the belly. Showing a young boy at the edge of the raised beds how to press his thumb gently into the soil to test if it needed water. Dara stood at the corner for a very long time. Then she walked back to her car. She drove home. She sat at her desk and did not write a single word for 3 days. On the 4th day, she picked up her phone and found May's number and called it. She introduced herself honestly. She said what she had seen. She said she wanted to write about it. She said she understood if the answer was no and that she would respect whatever May decided completely. There was a pause on the line. Then May said, "Come on Saturday. Eat first, then we can talk." Dara came. She ate. The food stopped her in a way she had not expected. It was not fancy. It was not the kind of meal you photograph before you eat it. It was the kind of meal that tastes like somebody made it while thinking about you. Like the person at the stove was not just cooking food, but was saying, through every ingredient and every stir of the pot, that you were worth the effort of being fed well, that you deserved warmth, that you were welcome here. She ate everything in the bowl. When the table was cleared and the afternoon had gone gold and quiet, she and May sat together on the porch steps. Dara asked, "Why haven't you told anyone about this?" May looked out at the street, at the garden, at Thomas and Callum carrying the folded table inside, at the lavender moving in the October wind. "My son gave me this house," she said. "He did not give it to me so I could show everyone what my son gave me." Dara waited. "He gave it to me because once, a long time ago, someone brought us soup." May paused. "I have been trying to become that person my whole life. I did not need a house to do it, but the house made it louder." Dara looked at her hands. "Can I write about it?" she asked. "You can write about the table," May said. "You can write about the people, but remember, this is their story too, not only mine." They sat quietly for a moment. Then Dara asked, "Does Elon know what you've done here?" A small pause. "He knows I'm doing something," May said. "He doesn't know what yet." "Are you going to tell him?" And then May smiled. Not the careful public smile. The real one. The one that arrived on its own because something was exactly true, and the truth of it was quietly delightful to her. "He'll find out," she said. "They always do." She stood and went inside. Dara remained on the steps for a long time after the front door closed. She listened to the wind moving through the last of the season's lavender. She watched the light go slowly gold and then amber, and then soft pink on the tree-lined street. Then she went home and she wrote. She wrote for 6 hours without stopping. She wrote about the table and the mismatched chairs and the wildflowers and the steam. She wrote about Thomas with his carpenter's hands and the porch steps he fixed without being asked. She wrote about Rosalind in the green notebook and the 417 names. She wrote about a woman who had been given something and had immediately turned it outward, the way you turn a window to let in light. She did not write the biggest part, not because she chose to protect it, but because she did not know it yet. Nobody knew it yet. Nobody except Rosalind. Rosalind had known for 2 months. She had carried it quietly and carefully, the way she carried everything. And she had written it down on the very last page of the green notebook, in handwriting that was smaller than usual. As if she had known that what she was writing was too large for full-size letters. As if she had needed to make the words compact just to fit the weight of them on a single page. What was written there? "We are almost there. But first, there is one more thing that needs to happen. One more person needs to walk up those porch steps. And his name is one you already know. Elon Musk does not surprise easily. This is a man who has watched rockets he built fall into the ocean and explode and gone back to work the very next morning. This is a man who has been told by serious people in serious rooms more than once that what he wanted to do could not be done, and who smiled the way you smile when you already know the ending and have simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. He has held the impossible in his hand so many times that the word has nearly lost its meaning for him. He is not easily surprised, but his mother surprised him. Dara's article went up on a Wednesday morning. It was not short. It was not vague. It was the kind of piece that had clearly been written by someone who had sat with the story long enough to feel its full weight before putting a single word down. Careful and precise and full of detail that put you right there on that porch. The steam from the pots. The mismatched chairs pushed up around the long table. The wildflowers in the jar going soft at the edges in the October cool. The boy at the raised beds with his small hands in the soil, learning from a carpenter with large ones. She had not written May's full name in the headline, but she had written enough. By Thursday morning, people had connected what dots remained. By Friday, the story had traveled in every direction. It was being shared by people who never shared things, sent by text to people who never clicked links, read aloud by people to other people sitting nearby because some things are too full to hold alone. On Saturday morning, a car came down the tree-lined street and parked quietly at the curb. Selene had called ahead. Selene always called ahead, because Selene understood that the people in Mai's kitchen deserved the same consideration as anyone in any boardroom. She had said only, "He is coming today. He wants to come to the table." May had been standing at the stove when the call came. She said, "Good. Tell him to bring an appetite." He arrived alone. No security team, no second car, just a driver who stayed at the wheel, and a man who got out and stood on the pavement for a moment before walking toward the house. He came up the porch steps slowly, the steps that Thomas had fixed. He stopped at the top and looked. The table was already full. People sitting shoulder to shoulder in the mismatched chairs, bowls in front of them, breath visible in the cool November air. The garden was visible beyond the railing, the raised bed standing straight and orderly, the last of the autumn kale still dark and green in the morning light. From the kitchen window came the sound of pots and the low hum of conversation, and once clearly the big rolling laugh of a man named Gerald, who had opinions about everything and hid from nothing. Elon stood at the top of the porch steps and looked at all of it. He had given his mother a house. She had filled it with the world. May came through the front door and stood beside him. She did not announce him. She did not put her arm through his or steer him toward the table with fanfare. She just stood beside him the way she had always stood. Straight and easy and completely unimpressed by the size of things, because she had always measured life by different numbers than most people used. They stood together for a moment in silence. Then he said quietly, "You turned it into a food program." She said, "I turned it into a table." "Is there a difference?" "Yes," she said. She looked at him directly. "A food program feeds stomachs. A table feeds people. The stomach is only part of it." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression that she had been giving him his entire life. The one that said, "I know exactly who you are. I knew before you did. And I have never once been disappointed." "Come and eat," she said. He came. He sat between Rosalind, who introduced herself with a firm handshake and went straight back to her work, and a man named Gerald who was 74 years old and wasted absolutely no time before explaining to Elon, in considerable detail, the 3 things that every person got wrong about beef stew, and why this was a problem worth taking seriously. Elon listened. He ate. He was quiet in the way he was always quiet in moments that mattered. Not absent, but absorbing. His eyes moved around the table and the garden and the porch and the people with the same attention he gave to engineering problems, looking at how everything connected, how it all held together, what made it work. What made it work, he was beginning to understand, was very simple. Nobody here had to earn their seat. Thomas came and sat across from him at some point during the meal. Thomas did not change his posture or his tone or the way he held his bowl. He treated Elon the same way he treated everyone else at the table, which was with the plain and uncomplicated respect of a man who had spent 40 years building things and understood that the worth of a person had nothing to do with what they owned. He nodded toward May, who was down the far end of the table, leaning in to listen to something a young woman was saying, her full attention given completely and without reservation. "She's something else," Thomas said. "She always has been," Elon said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "You gave her this house?" "Yes." Thomas turned his cup slowly in both hands. He looked at the table, at the garden, at the porch steps he had repaired on a morning when he had needed something to fix almost as much as the steps had needed fixing. "She gave it back," he said, "just differently." He said it the way carpenters say things. No extra words, no dressing on it. Just the plain fact of it, set down on the table between them like a tool that had done its job. Elon looked at his mother again. She was passing a bowl to someone. She was listening. She was laughing the real laugh, the one he had heard his whole life and that belonged to no stage and no audience, and no version of herself that she performed for the world. Just her. Just May. He had given her the house. She had given it to everyone. He felt something then that was not surprise and not pride and not exactly either of those things, but was somehow both and also something that lived past them. The feeling you get when something turns out to be not just good, but correct. Not just kind, but necessary. Not just a gift, but an answer to a question that had been sitting open for 30 years. When the table had cleared and the last of the guests had gone and Gerald was inside washing pots and lecturing Rosalind about stew with the dedication of a man who believed strongly that the world improved one corrected recipe at a time, Elon and May sat together on the porch in the thin afternoon sun. He said, "Did you always know you were going to do this?" "Since the moment I pressed my hand against the kitchen wall," she said. He did not ask what that meant. He already knew. He had learned to read her silences when he was 9 years old, and he had never forgotten. "Rosalind told me you're working on making it official," he said. "Non-profit status." "Yes." "You'll need funding. I can—" "No," she said. Simply, without sharpness. He stopped. She turned to look at him with the full patience of a woman who had been making decisions on her own terms for 60 years and was not about to change the habit now. "You gave me the house," she said. "That was yours to give. What I do with it is mine." A pause. "But if you want to sit at this table on Saturdays, you are welcome here." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "And bring something when you come," she added, turning back to the garden. "You don't arrive at a table empty-handed." He almost smiled. "What should I bring?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the garden, at the raised beds, at the bare November trees at the end of the street. She was thinking, or perhaps remembering, which sometimes looks like the same thing from the outside. Then she said, "Oranges." Just the one word. And Elon Musk, the man who had sent rockets into orbit, who had looked at the impossible and called it a starting point, who had carried for 30 years the memory of a cold hallway and a closed door, and the sound of his mother crying in the dark and the helpless boy he had been who could not fix it, pressed his hand flat over his own mouth for one brief second. His eyes were very bright. He nodded. Oranges. Dorothea had left them on the porch in a bag. Every week sometimes. Long ago in Toronto. In the cold. Of course it was oranges. We have to talk about the last page now. You have been patient. You have walked this whole road. Through the cold Toronto winter and the two thin coats and the soup and the house and the table and the garden and the boy outside the closed door and the woman who pressed her palm flat against a kitchen wall to feel the solid fact of something real. You have earned it. Here it is. Rosalind's green notebook had 417 names in it the morning May called her in May. By October, when Dara's article went live and the world started paying attention, that number had grown by 29. The Saturday table had served hundreds of individual meals. The garden had produced all the way through summer and deep into autumn. Thomas had built a cold frame to stretch the growing season further, and Callum had gotten a job. And Gerald had strong opinions about Stu that he shared generously with everyone whether they asked or not. The notebook was nearly full, but the last page was different from every page before it. It was not names. It was not a list of people who had eaten or a record of a morning that mattered. It was one address. Written in the center of the page, in Rosalind's careful, upright handwriting. And beside it, a single note in smaller letters, the way you write things when the thing itself is too heavy for full-sized words. She has been outside every Saturday. She watches from across the street. She never comes in. The address was directly across from May's house, on the same tree-lined street, the same lavender-edged walk, the same October light. Just on the other side of it, in a house that was smaller and quieter, and had a kettle in the kitchen whose handle had been wrapped in tape because it had been used so many thousands of times that it had worn smooth. The person who lived there was 81 years old. Her silver hair was still cut close to her head. Her hands were still warm, the way they had always been. Her name was Dorothea Crane, the soup lady. She had moved to this neighborhood 6 years ago after her husband passed, and the old house in Toronto became too large for one person and too full of the particular silence that moves in when someone who filled a space is suddenly gone. She had packed her things and sold the house and come here without knowing a single soul on the street, because she had never needed to know people in advance to believe that she would find her way among them. She had not known when May moved in across the street, when the car pulled up and the boxes came out and a woman stood in the morning light directing things with the calm authority of someone who had moved enough times in her life to have made peace with it. She had not known that this woman was the same young mother from that cold Toronto evening 40 years before. But on the third Saturday, standing at her front window with her morning tea, watching the table set itself on the porch across the street, the long table and the mismatched chairs and the jar of wildflowers and the steam rising from pots that were too big for one person. She had looked at the woman moving through it all, and something had shifted quietly in her chest. She had recognized her. And then she had set her tea down, and she had not crossed the street. Not because she did not want to, because she wanted to too much, and the wanting had weight to it. 40 years of weight. The weight of a cold evening and a pot carried across a road, and a young woman's smile cracking open into something more honest than a smile. The weight of wondering across all those years how that family had turned out, how those children had grown, Whether the fire she had seen in that young mother had stayed lit. It had stayed lit. It had stayed so lit it had become a table with 20 people around it. But standing at the edge of her own driveway or watching from her window on Saturday mornings with her tea cooling in her hands, Dorothea could not find the courage to walk across and say, "It was me. I was the one with the soup. Do you remember? Was it anything? Did it matter at all?" She was afraid the moment would be too big. She was afraid 40 years was too long. She was afraid that an old woman in a cardigan crossing a street with nothing in her hands was not enough of a thing to offer. Rosalind had noticed her in September. Rosalind noticed everything and everyone. That was the whole point of the green notebook, the whole reason the names were written down. She had walked across the street one morning and introduced herself, and had a short, pleasant conversation with Dorothea, who was polite and warm and gave nothing away about why she watched the table every week, without ever coming to sit at it. But Rosalind wrote the address on the last page. She waited. In November, on a Tuesday when the street was quiet and the raised beds were resting under their first thin skin of frost, she stood in the kitchen with May and opened the notebook to the last page and held it out without a word. May read it. She went very still. The same stillness as when she had first pressed her palm against this kitchen wall. The same quality of a person whose whole body is being asked to hold something larger than it expected. "How long has you known?" she said, very quietly. "Since September," Rosalind said. May looked out the window for a long time. The empty garden, the bare beds, the street lying quiet in the November gray. "What do you want to do?" Rosalind asked. The silence stretched out, slow and full. Then May said, "I am going to make soup." She made it that evening. A large pot. The kind of soup that takes hours, the kind where you put it on in the afternoon and by the time the sky goes dark, the whole house smells like warmth, and the steam fogs the kitchen windows and something in you uncoils a little just from being near it. She cooked it slowly, her hands busy, her mind elsewhere. She thought about a January evening in Toronto. She thought about a woman standing in the cold with a pot. She thought about the exact words. She had never forgotten the exact words. When it was done, she transferred it carefully into a pot she could carry in both arms. She put on her coat. She walked across the street. She stood on Dorothea's porch and knocked. The door opened. Dorothea stood in the doorway in a cardigan the color of winter wheat, with the light from the hall behind her. She looked at May. May looked at Dorothea. They looked at each other across the threshold and across 40 years, and across all the distance that had ever been between them, and all the distance that was no longer there. Then Dorothea's hand rose slowly to her mouth. May held out the pot. She said, "I made too much. Would you like some?" The exact words, the exact tone. After 40 years, Dorothea stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes full and brimming and could not speak for a long moment that stretched out like the space between a held breath and a released one. Then she stepped back. She opened the door wider. Her voice when it came was barely holding the shape of itself. "Come in," she said. "Come in, come in." They sat in the small warm kitchen with the photographs on the refrigerator and the kettle with the taped handle, and May poured the soup and they ate together slowly in the particular piece of two people who have found each other on the other side of a very long road. And then they talked for 3 hours. About everything. About the cold and the coats and the children and the years. About the table in the garden, and Rosalind's notebook, and Thomas's carpenter hands, and Callum finding his footing, and Gerald and his convictions about Stu. About Elon and the house and the oranges. About what it means when someone carries a single act of kindness forward for 40 years and builds something from it that feeds hundreds of people and reaches across oceans. About what a pot of soup becomes when it is given to the right person at the right moment. At the end, Dorothea said, "I should have come across the street sooner." May shook her head. "You came across the street 40 years ago," she said. "That was when it mattered most." Dorothea looked at her hands for a long moment. Her warm, still warm hands that had carried a pot across a snowy road on an evening in January in a different city in a different decade, and had never once suspected what they were setting in motion. May asked, "Will you come on Saturday? To the table?" Dorothea looked up. "What should I bring?" she asked. May smiled. "The real one, full and unheld." "Whatever you have too much of," she said. Dara's article had already changed things before the Dorothea part of the story came out. People had shared it and cried over it and printed it and texted it to people they had not spoken to in years. It had done what the very best stories do. It had made people feel less alone in their own lives, as if someone had held a light up in a dark room and shown them they were not the only one standing in it. But the Dorothea part was different. Maya told it herself. Not through a journalist, not through an interview. In a single post in her own voice, written the way she did everything. Without performance, without decoration, trusting the plain truth of it to carry its own weight. She wrote, "When I was a young mother with 3 children and not enough of anything, a neighbor brought me soup. She said she had made too much. I have spent 40 years trying to be her. On Tuesday, I found out she lives across the street from the house my son gave me. I brought her soup. I used the same words. We ate together. She is coming to the table on Saturday. That is the story. That is the whole story." The internet, which is so often a loud and difficult and exhausting place, full of arguments that go nowhere and noise that means nothing, went completely quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that only happens when something lands so squarely in the center of what it means to be a human being, that even the loudest voices stop. Just briefly, just long enough to feel it. And then it was not quiet at all. The post moved across the world in hours. It was shared by people who never shared things. Sent by text to parents and siblings and old friends with nothing written above it except the link, because no words felt adequate to add. Read aloud by one person to another sitting right beside them, because some things are too large to hold alone inside your own eyes. Journalists called it a full circle story. Teachers printed it and read it to classrooms of children who listened without fidgeting, which anyone who has ever taught a classroom of children will tell you is remarkable. A grandmother in Ohio taped it to her refrigerator. A man in Glasgow sent it to his estranged sister with no message, and also just the link. She called him the next day. They talked for an hour. It was the first time they had spoken in 3 years. The Saturday table received more food donations in the week that followed than it had received in all the months before. Rosalind had to buy a second notebook. Mai gave 3 short interviews. She kept each one brief. She said the same thing each time in different words. "I am not an organization. I am a woman with a table. The table grew from something someone did for me a long time ago. I am passing it forward. Anyone can do this. Anyone." Elon said nothing publicly for several days. Then he posted one sentence. Just one. No explanation before or after. No context, no press release. One sentence that he had probably written and deleted and rewritten more than once before he finally let it stand. My mother is the most remarkable person I have ever known. 15 million people responded. Thomas, who did not have any social media accounts and had no intention of getting any, heard about it from Callum, who read the sentence aloud to him one Saturday morning on the porch, while Thomas was working on the cold frame latch. Thomas listened to it with the side of his face turned toward the garden. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "Sounds about right." He went back to the latch. Callum watched him work. After a while, he said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Thomas kept working. "What's that?" "The first day I came here," Callum said. "I sat at that table and didn't say a word to anyone. I just ate. I thought I was invisible. I thought nobody saw me at all." Thomas set his tool down. He turned and looked at Callum directly, the way a carpenter looks at a joint he wants to make sure will hold. "Rosalind wrote your name down," he said. "That first Saturday, she writes everyone's name down." He let that sit for a moment. "Nobody at this table is invisible," he said. Callum looked at the garden for a long time. At the straight raised beds and the dark soil and the cold frame Thomas had built to keep things growing past the season when growing things usually stopped. Then he picked up a tool and helped finish the latch. Dorothea came that Saturday. She brought a cake, a proper one made from scratch, with a pale yellow frosting that she had clearly spent time on. She set it on the table between the wildflower jar and the big soup pot, as if it had always belonged exactly there. She sat at the far end of the long table in her winter wheat cardigan, and she ate and she laughed and she told stories. About the Toronto winter, about a small boy with enormous drawings of rocket ships, about the way that same small boy had solemnly called her the Soup Lady, until the day he learned her name and switched with equal solemnity to using it. May covered her face with both hands and laughed until her shoulders shook. Rosalind, sitting beside her, did not write any of it in the notebook. Some things live better in the place inside you that does not need pages. Elon was there for part of it, seated at the far end of the table from Dorothea. When the moment came, someone introduced them simply, without ceremony, the way introductions at that table always went. He looked at her. She looked at him. At this man who had put rockets in space and whose name was known in every country on the earth, and who had pressed his hand over his mouth when his mother said the word oranges. And she was not the least bit intimidated. She was 81 years old. She had been a teacher. She had seen everything. He said quietly, "You brought my mother soup." She looked back at him with the level warmth of a woman who had always known the worth of small things. "She brought me soup back," Dorothea said. 40 years is a long time to wait, but the soup was worth it. He laughed. She laughed. The whole table laughed. The steam from the pots rose into the cold November air above the long table, and the mismatched chairs and the wildflowers going soft at the end of their season, and the people sitting shoulder to shoulder with their bowls in front of them, none of them invisible, every one of them known, all of their names written down somewhere. The lavender moved in the autumn wind. Everything was exactly as it was always supposed to be. By spring, things had changed. Not with noise. Not with a single large moment that everyone could point to and say, "There, that is when it happened." Real change rarely works that way. Real change works the way water works on stone. Slowly, steadily, invisibly, until one morning you look at the stone and realize it is not the same shape it used to be, and you cannot say exactly when it shifted, only that it did. The Saturday table became official in March. It was registered as a non-profit organization with a name that had been chosen by Rosalind and approved quietly by everyone who had been part of the beginning, the Sparrow Table. Named after a poem Rosalind had loved since she was a girl in Lagos. A poem about small, overlooked things that show up anyway, that do not ask permission to matter, that keep returning to the same place regardless of the season or the weather or whether anyone is watching. Rosalind ran it. Maya sat on the board. The kitchen with the morning windows became the center of something that now had structure and paperwork and official standing in the world, but had not changed in the way it felt to walk up those porch steps on a Saturday morning and find a seat at the long table and be handed a bowl of something hot. Thomas built a second set of raised beds in the spring, wider and longer than the first. The neighbors along the street started contributing. Seedlings appeared in paper bags left by the garden gate. Tomatoes and sweet peppers and 3 kinds of basil, and a climbing bean that Thomas trained up a structure he built from leftover timber in an afternoon. The garden became something that belonged to the whole street now, not just the house. Callum had his own apartment by February, a small one on the 3rd floor of a building 20 minutes away, with a window that faced east and let in morning light. He came back every Saturday without fail. He had started teaching a woodworking class for teenagers at a community center 2 evenings a week. Nothing elaborate, just the basics, how to measure and cut and join and sand, how to make something solid and useful with your own hands. Sometimes he brought the teenagers with him on Saturdays. They helped in the garden, they sat at the table. 3 of them came back so many times that the table began to feel like theirs. The way it should feel, the way it was always meant to feel, the way that something only truly lives when the people inside it stop thinking of themselves as guests and start thinking of themselves as part of it. Dara came to one of the Sunday training days that Mai and Rosalind had begun running for people who wanted to start tables in their own neighborhoods. She sat at the back of the kitchen with a notepad in her lap. She did not publish a word of what she heard that day. She had covered the story long enough to understand the difference between things that needed to be written and things that needed to be lived. Some things are made smaller by being turned into text. Some things need to stay in the room where they happened. Priya, whose one quiet photograph had started everything unraveling into the world, was writing a book. Not a large book with a big publisher and a lot of noise around it. A small one. The kind that travels by being pressed into someone's hands with no explanation. Just the book itself and the look on the face of the person handing it over. It was about the table. About all of them. She dedicated it to Dorothea, who found this both mortifying and deeply moving, and told Priya both things directly, which made Priya love her completely. Dorothea kept coming every Saturday. She kept bringing cake. She was 81 years old and had spent 4 decades quietly holding the memory of one cold evening and one pot of soup and one young mother's smile cracking open into something more honest than a smile. Holding it without knowing whether it had mattered, without any way to know, just carrying it forward the way you carry things you cannot put down. Now she sat at the long table every week and was known. Her name was in the notebook. She was not invisible. In early May, she and May sat together on the porch steps after the table had been cleared, and the last guests had gone and the evening light was doing what evening light does in May, going slowly gold and then soft and then almost too beautiful to look at directly. Dorothea said, "I never thought that pot of soup would go this far." May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Most things that go far start very small." They sat with that for a little while. Then Dorothea said, "Do you think Elon knows what he really built when he bought you this house?" May looked at the house, at the wide porch and the morning windows and the lavender along the front walk, and the raised beds and the long table folded against the wall and the mismatched chairs stacked neatly beside it, waiting for Saturday. "He thought he was buying a house," she said. A pause. "He built a table." Another pause, longer. "And the table built all of this." She lifted one hand and let it fall. At the garden, the street, the invisible enormous web of names and meals and moments and people who had walked up those porch steps not knowing what they needed and walked back down again carrying something they had not arrived with. All of it grown from one pot of soup on one cold evening in Toronto in a year that was now 40 years gone. Dorothea nodded slowly. They sat together in the quiet that follows when something has been said that is completely true and does not need anything added to it. From inside the house came the familiar sound of Gerald washing dishes and explaining to Rosalind, at considerable length and volume, precisely where the stew had gone wrong this week. Rosalind's patient voice said something indistinct in return. Gerald's voice rose slightly. May and Dorothea looked at each other. They both laughed. Quietly, warmly, the way people laugh when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. The lavender moved along the front walk. The light went all the way gold and then began slowly to let go. And somewhere deep in May's memory, behind everything that had happened, and everything that had been built, and every Saturday, and every name in the notebook, and every bowl and every hand pressed flat against a wall to feel the solid, real fact of something that was truly hers. A young woman stood in a cold kitchen a long time ago and pressed her hand against the wall and felt it and never once let go. There is one more thing. It is the thing that only May knew. The thing she had carried quietly inside the whole story, through every Saturday and every bowl and every name written down and every raised bed and every person who walked up those porch steps not knowing what they needed and walked back down again a little less alone. She had never told it to anyone. Until a Sunday morning in June when she stood in the kitchen beside the window with the morning light falling gold and warm across the wooden floor. And she looked out at the room full of people who had come from other neighborhoods and other cities to learn how to build a table of their own. She looked at them for a moment. Then she began. She said, "When I was young and we had very little, I made myself a promise. The promise was this: someday when things are better, I will give back what was given to me. I will find the people who are where I once was, and I will be for them what someone was for me." The room was listening the way rooms listen when a person speaks from somewhere true. "The problem," she said, "is that I made that promise and then I kept waiting. Things got better and I waited for the right moment. Things got worse and I waited for them to get better again. Things got better again and I found something else to wait for. The right house, the right kitchen, the right set of circumstances that would finally make it the right time." She paused. The morning light moved slowly across the floor between them. "And then my son gave me a house." She stopped for a moment, not for effect, just because the truth of it still settled in her chest in a way that required a beat of silence to hold properly. The house was beautiful, It was real. And I walked through it and I stood in this kitchen and I pressed my hand flat against that wall. She turned and pressed her open palm against the kitchen wall behind her. The same wall, the same gesture, the same solid fact of it. And I understood something that I should have understood 30 years earlier. She lowered her hand. She looked at the room. There is no perfect moment, she said. There is only the moment you are standing in, and the table you choose to build from what is already in front of you. Not a sound from the room. Not even a shift in a chair. The house was not what started the table, she said. The table was always there. It was there inside every year I waited. Inside every morning I said someday instead of today. The house did not create it. The house just made it louder. She smiled then. The real one. Do not wait for the house, she said. Start with what you have. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after that. The kind of quiet that is not empty but full. Full of people turning something over inside themselves, holding it up to the light, recognizing something in it that belonged to them. Then a hand went up near the back of the room. A young woman, maybe 22 years old. She had driven 4 hours that morning, alone, because something in the story had reached through a screen and taken hold of something in her that she could not name but could not ignore either. She said, "What if I don't have much?" May looked at her across the room with the calm and complete attention she gave to everyone. "What do you have?" she asked. The young woman thought about it. Not quickly, genuinely. She looked at her own hands in her lap, the way a person does when they are taking an honest inventory of what they actually hold. "I have a porch," she said, "and a big pot." May nodded once. Slowly, with the certainty of a woman who had built everything she had ever built from exactly that kind of beginning. "Then you have enough," she said. The young woman's name was Clara. It was not written in a notebook that day. There was no green spiral notebook in the kitchen for this particular Sunday morning in June. But it was written somewhere. In that larger and harder to measure record that has no pages and no spine and no cover, and cannot be bought for $2 at a drugstore, but that keeps faithfully and permanently the name of every moment when something real begins. Clara drove home that evening through the last of the summer light. She called her sister before she even reached the highway. She talked the whole way home. Her sister listened and then said yes, and then said when, and then said, "I will come early and help you set up." That Saturday, in a city 300 miles from the tree-lined street with the lavender along the walk, and the raised beds and the long table folded against the porch wall, waiting for morning. A new porch held a new table, mismatched chairs pulled up around it, a jar of wildflowers, small and bright, set in the center, a big pot on the stove inside, sending steam through an open window into the cool, early morning air. And people coming, one at first, then two, then more. Because that is what a table does when it is built from the right thing and set in the right spirit and left open to anyone who needs it. It fills, it always fills. And that is the story. A pot of soup, a house, a table, a world that got a little wider and a little warmer because one person decided not to wait for the perfect moment and just started with what she had. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city, your country, your corner of the world in the comments right now. We read every single one. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something you want to hold on to, hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it helps this story reach someone who needs it today. And if you believe that kindness is worth spreading, subscribe to this channel. Every story we tell is built on that same idea, that small things done with care go further than anyone expects. One last thing, there is another story waiting for you right now, appearing on your screen this very moment. Click on it, because the best time to be reminded that people are good is always right now.